here's a clip of the Russian defense minister Shoigu, and he's saying that the Ukrainians want to strike Crimea with the help of the United States and the United Kingdom. Let's just watch the clip, and then I'll go into it. All right.
Украинские войска продолжают предпринимать попытки наступательных действий на Южнодонецком, Запорожском и Донецком направлениях. При этом киевский режим задействует большое количество западных вооружений, элитные соединения, личный состав которых обучался специалистами НАТО. 4 июня вооруженные силы Украины предприняли 263 атаки позиций российских войск. Благодаря грамотным и самоотверженным действиям наших подразделений все они отбиты, противник цели не достиг. По нашим данным, руководство вооруженных сил Украины планирует нанести удары по территории Российской Федерации, включая Крым, ракетами «Хаймарс» и «Storm Shadow». Применение этих ракет вне зоны проведения специальной военной операции будет означать полноценное втягивание Соединенных Штатов Америки и Великобритании в конфликт и повлечет незамедлительные удары по центрам принятия решений на территории Украины.
Okay, so when he says decision-making centers within Ukraine, he's talking about Zelensky and Kiev, obviously, where the government is. So let's break this down, right? I mean, Crimea, in case you don't know, this is on the Black Sea. It's a peninsula, and it used to, I mean, it's, as far as I know, it's always been Russian. Then during the Cold War, it was transferred to Ukraine, even though this was the same country, right? The Soviet Union. So within the Soviet Union, it was transferred from Russia to Ukraine. And then the Russians took it back in 2014. If you look at the population, the demographic of people in Crimea, they have always been majority Russian. So over 50% of the people who live in Crimea, whether it was, Ukraine, or it's Russian occupied, as they say today, they've always said that we are Russian, we identify as Russians, we are ethnically Russian, whatever, however you want to phrase it, doesn't matter, right? So listen to what he's saying. He's saying, now, again, we're going to take this with a pinch of salt, because just for the sake of argument, right? And let's say he's bluffing, right? He's making this up. Why would the Russian defense minister go and lie about this? Okay, well, maybe he's trying to do what the Americans do, right? So they think that maybe there's actually going to be an attack on Crimea. Like the Crimea Bridge was one incident that happened. You had also, this is last month, look at May 2023. You had drone attacks in Crimea, okay? Here, this is from Al Jazeera. Blasts rock Russia annexed Crimea, etc. Right? So, and he's trying to deter. He's trying to tell them, like, we know that you're going to do this and we're going to deter you, right? So that was what Blinken and the spokespersons in the United States were saying every time. Like, we know that you Chinese are up to something, so we're going to call you out now to prevent you from doing it. We're telling the whole world. We're going to tell on you. Okay. I mean, the difference here is that most of these, claims about China and Russia are bogus and made up by the CIA. In this case, I'm not saying that the Russians don't have their own propaganda, because they do. But if this is serious and he's real, like, about them using, remember, he singled out not NATO, but British and American weapons, right? He said Storm Shadow, which is British. The French also use it. But no one cares about the French. Je déconne. I'm joking. And he mentioned HIMARS, which is the American system that was given to Ukraine, right? And HIMARS is adaptable. You can have short range, long range missiles. But the idea was, we're going to give HIMARS to the Ukrainians, but only short range, because we don't want them attacking the Russians. Here's the thing, though. If you attack Crimea with HIMARS or with Storm Shadow, Shoigu, he said very specifically, he said, outside of the context of the special military operation. When he says special military operation, that's the Russians' wording for what's happening now, this war in Ukraine, okay? So, because for them, special military operation is not a war, it's a, designated small area. Well, small, it's not really small, but you know what I mean. It's the war in Ukraine. And the point here that I'm trying to tell you is that the Russians are very clearly drawing a red line and saying, if you attack Crimea, which we consider Russian and to the core, right? Probably more than Eastern Ukraine. If you attack Crimea, we are not going to consider this something within the context of the war in Ukraine. We are going to consider this a hot war. Okay, we are going to consider that the United States and the United Kingdom are directly attacking Russia, directly, not through Ukraine, directly. So he is warning our governments, although I really doubt Biden and Sunak constitute governments, but unfortunately these are the people in power. Jesus, I hate saying this out loud. But he is warning our governments not to go ahead with this. And remember, when we say go ahead with this, I mean the Crimea bridge attack has MI6 written all over it, okay? The Nord Stream pipeline attacks, this again has and the Kakhovka, the Nova Kakhovka dam attack, Christ, what a mouthful. It's also, it has the UK written all over it. I know the Americans, they like to blow up their own fair share of things, but this is very British when you blow up, industrial sized civilian infrastructure like pipelines, like dams. This is a lot of expertise, shall we put it, that was gathered by Britain during World War II, blowing up German infrastructure, German pipelines and German dams and so on, right? So for, and German bridges, right? Going back to Crimea. So the Crimea Bridge, Nord Stream, Nova Kakhovka Dam, these are all things that have UK and US written all over them. And he's saying now, if you use these, if you strike Crimea with HIMARS and Storm Shadow, we will consider this an act of war. I mean, I'm gonna argue the other point of view here and say that this is a bit of a joke, because Russia always has these red lines. And what do they do about it? They don't even. They're even laughing about this on Al Jazeera. I was gonna play the clip, but I've lost it now. It doesn't matter. They were saying the same thing. The Russians always say this is a red line, and then the Ukrainians cross it and they don't do anything. And yeah, unfortunately, you see the same thing, unfortunately, when it comes to the resistance in the Middle East. But that's another issue, right? If you're the Russian defense minister, how on earth is the current situation with NATO supplying Ukraine? I mean, to the brim with weapons. With you mentioned them yourself: HIMARS, Storm Shadow, the tanks, the Leopards, the Bradleys. How on earth is that not a hot war? Everybody and their uncle knows it's a hot war. You know it's a hot war. So why does it take them striking Crimea for you to appreciate the gravity and the significance of the situation? It shouldn't. Crimea has nothing to do with this, really. You're already in a hot war, is what I'm trying to tell you. You are already there. In any case, let me tell you something. The Russians, for them, Crimea, like I told you, it's always been majority ethnic Russian. Okay, majority. That is not the case for people for the four regions they annexed in Ukraine. Right? You absolutely have a lot of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in Eastern Ukraine, but not a majority like in Crimea. So for them, maybe this is his way of saying Crimea is a hot issue for us. This is a bridge too far. No pun intended. It's a bridge too far. After the Crimea Bridge, of course. Sorry, I'm enjoying my own joke, but I must say something. Forget what the Russians declare. Just from my point of view as a journalist and a political analyst, how many red lines are we going to cross before we reach a hot button issue like Crimea or Moscow? Because the Kremlin has been drone striked. I mean, this is a phrase that if you said this during the Cold War, people would look at you like, what? And yet we are here. And I asked Ray McGovern the other day, you saw when I was interviewing him, and he lived and worked through the Cold War against the Russians, that back then is the Soviets, different issue, different time. But I told him, and you saw me, I asked him, like, could you have imagined this kind of behavior in the Cold War? and he studied Russian, right? So he studied Russian culture and the Russian language, and he speaks Russian fluently. So he's a very deep admiration for Russian culture, and he worked in the CIA as an analyst and so on. And so he knows both sides of the coin, so to speak, right? He knows both sides of the coin. He knows the Russian world and the English-speaking or Anglo-Saxon world. And, and he said it's outrageous, it's crazy. And that's what I have told you all along. So we have gotten into a situation where it's become acceptable to cross lines that would have, red lines that would have been unimaginable 40 years ago, 30 years ago. But we are there. So I really don't know what's going to happen if they hit Crimea. Maybe that's what it takes for the Russians to launch nukes. Do we really want to find out? I don't want to find out. Please don't find out. Are you going to drone strike Moscow again? Please don't. I don't want to find out if that's when the Russians start launching nukes. This has gotten too far. This whole situation has gone too far. Way too far. It's so crazy. You got everybody like on Earth trying to say, you got African delegation all the way from Africa, because again, the grain situation and many other factors, many factors affect the rest of the planet, not just Africa. But you got African leaders. You got people from Egypt. You got people from South Africa, sitting in Kiev, sitting in Moscow, telling them both, can you stop? The situation has gone so out of control. You are affecting everybody from here to Europe, to Africa, to the United States, etc., right? And never, and of course Asia as well. So I really don't know what to tell you here. I really don't know what to say, except that this is very, very, very dangerous if they are thinking about using Storm Shadow and HIMARS. There's a saying. There's a saying about the straw that broke the camel's back. A camel can carry so much weight, right? A human plus cargo, etc. But just one straw sometimes is, how light is a straw. One straw is enough to break a camel's back, and they can't take it anymore. Now, when I say break the camel's back in this situation, I'm talking about the Russian leadership, shall we say, because this war is playing out, it's playing out in Ukraine and it's playing out in Russia. And the thing is that the Russians are the ones who have nukes. Ukraine had nukes at one point, they gave them up, but all it takes is just a few mistakes, not even intentional. It could be real, just a genuine mistake. And then one side, or whether the Russians or the United States, they start launching nukes, it just takes a tiny mistake. And it's game over for everyone. There's no way you are going back from that. Because I know this sounds simple, and perhaps most of you already understand this, but I think it warrants repeating at a time like this. All it takes is a small incident for one of the countries, the Russians or the Americans or UK even, to start launching nukes. And once that happens, everyone is going to launch their nukes. The Russians will start, or the Americans start, then the other side will also send everything they have. Even, there's something called the dead hand, right? Like, even if you wipe out Moscow, let's say Zelensky, he hires the best snipers in the West, and he sends them to Moscow, and they take out Shoigu and Putin and Lavrov and the entire leadership in one fell swoop. In one fell swoop. You know what happens? You have Russian submarines, who the hell knows where, on the North Pole, the South Pole, doesn't matter, they could be anywhere on Earth, with nuclear weapons. And then the decision-making falls to them. And they can launch their nuclear missiles at Washington, at London, and I think that probably makes a lot of people who are victims of Western imperialism salivate at the mouth. But obviously, that's going to be game over for everybody, unfortunately. And we don't want to go there. I know I keep repeating that, but it needs to be repeated. Let me again. Imagine Russia was thinking of striking the United States with cruise missiles. I mean, do you think Americans would accept that? Never.